Galactic Council mocked a human delegate. Moments later, everything changed. The chair they gave me was too tall. My feet did not touch the floor. I noticed it the moment I sat down in the conclave chamber, a sphere so enormous that the far side was hidden behind a low artificial cloud layer. 412 delegate platforms floated at various heights around the central axis, each one shaped, pressurized, and lit for the species seated on it. The Vrethkai had purple gas filling their enclosure. The Pelori sat under a heat lamp so powerful it would have cooked a human in 4 minutes. The Ulani, who had no solid bodies at all, simply drifted near their platform like slow smoke. And then there was mine, one flat platform, one chair, made of some pale material that was neither warm nor cold, positioned at the lowest level of the chamber, far below the senior delegates, close enough to the floor that any species looking down at me would see exactly what they intended, a representative of a civilization that had not yet earned the right to look anyone in the eye. My name is George Alderton. I was 41 years old. I had spent the previous 11 years of my life preparing for the next 2 hours. I did not look up at the gallery. I did not fidget. I placed my hands flat on the table in front of me, let out a breath I had been holding since the transport docked, and began to study the room. The chamber of the Galactic Conclave had been in continuous operation for 12,000 years. 12,000 years of decisions, treaties, wars averted, wars started, species uplifted and species quietly abandoned. The walls were engraved with the names of every species that had ever held a seat. Some of those names belonged to civilizations that no longer existed. The conclave had outlasted them. The conclave had outlasted almost everything. Earth had been applying for full membership for 60 years. 60 years of petitions. 60 years of careful diplomatic language. 60 years of our best people sitting in chairs exactly like mine, feet dangling, waiting to be told they were not ready. My predecessor, a woman named Clara Bowden, had made it further than anyone before her. She had gotten the conclave to acknowledge, formally, that humanity was not a threat to galactic stability. That was in 2187. It had taken her 9 years to achieve that single sentence. She retired afterward, not from exhaustion, but because she said she needed to be home when the real news came. Clara was 83 now. She had sent me one message before I boarded the transport. It said, "Do not apologize for existing." I kept thinking about that as the session was called to order. The presiding chair of the conclave was a Vrethkai elder named Sarethvel. I had studied recordings of Sarethvel for 3 years. I knew the way its head tendrils moved when it was dismissive. I knew the particular pitch of the sound it made when it was performing patience rather than feeling it. Sarethvel was 400 years old. It had presided over the rejection of 9 species membership applications. It had a reputation for fairness that was, in my professional opinion, almost entirely constructed. Sarethvel opened the session, and its first act was to introduce me. It did not say my name. It said, "The provisional observer representing the human collective." Not delegate, observer. The word had been chosen carefully. Observers did not have voting rights. Observers did not have floor time. Observers were present as a courtesy, the way you might leave a window open so a bird could watch what was happening inside the house. I wrote the word down on my notepad, then I drew a small circle around it. The first 3 hours of the session had nothing to do with Earth. The conclave handled a boundary dispute between the Pelori and the Shan, reviewed a request from a newly contacted species in the outer arm, and debated a proposal to restructure the trade monitoring body that had been under criticism for 2 centuries. I watched all of it. I took notes. I noticed which delegates spoke most and which ones listened most carefully. I noticed which ones looked at me when they thought I was not looking. Several of them were surprised to find me looking back. Then the Pelori senator spoke. His name was Uran Das. He was the second-ranking Pelori on the conclave floor, which made him the unofficial spokesperson whenever his superior wanted something said that could not be officially attributed. The Pelori were tall, copper-skinned, and had been spacefaring for 9,000 years. They considered themselves the architects of modern galactic civilization, an opinion they held with the absolute confidence of people who had never seriously been challenged. Urandas turned toward my platform. He did not address me directly. He addressed the chamber. He said that before the session moved to the matter of the human petition, he wanted to note, for the record, that the presence of a human observer in the chamber was itself a subject worth examining. He said that the conclave had always maintained strict standards for participation. He said that allowing a species with fewer than 300 years of interstellar travel to sit in this chamber, even as an observer, set a precedent that deserved scrutiny. Then he said something that the translation matrix rendered as, "One does not invite mayflies to advise on the management of forests." The chamber responded. I had read about the conclave's version of approval before, but reading about it and experiencing it were two different things. It was not laughter exactly. Each species expressed amusement differently. The Vrethkai clicked their tendrils, the Pelori made a low harmonic sound, the Shan flashed bioluminescent patterns across their membranes. But the meaning was universal. It rolled through the chamber in waves, 400 species sharing a single moment of agreement. The joke was that I did not belong here. I let it run its full course. I did not move. I did not change my expression. I had been told by Clara that the worst thing I could do was react, because a reaction would confirm exactly what they believed, that humanity was young, emotional, and easily rattled. I picked up my pen. I added Urandas's name below the word observer. I drew a circle around that too. When the chamber settled, Sarethvel formally acknowledged that the matter of Earth's petition would be addressed in the afternoon session. It noted, with the air of someone performing a kindness, that the human observer would be given 2 minutes to present a summary of the petition before the vote. 2 minutes, 60 years of waiting, and they were giving me 2 minutes. I wrote that down as well. What Sarethvel did not know, what none of them knew, was that I had not come here to summarize a petition. I had come here to show them something they had spent 12,000 years failing to notice. 2 minutes was more than enough. During the break, I sat alone in the observer lounge, which was a small room off the main corridor with a water dispenser and 2 chairs designed for beings twice my height. I did not mind the solitude. I needed the quiet. I opened my case. Inside was a data drive, a paper notebook, and a photograph. The photograph was old, printed on actual paper, which was unusual enough that it had been flagged at 3 separate checkpoints. It showed a group of people standing in front of a building. Most of them I had never met. They were the first human delegation to petition the conclave 60 years ago. They were smiling in the photograph. They had been, by all accounts, optimistic. I set the photograph on the table beside my notebook. Then I looked at the data drive. Everything we needed was on that drive. Not a threat, not a demand, something far more precise than either of those things. I had spent 11 years building the argument contained on that drive. Not alone. 340 scientists, economists, xenobiologists, and historians had contributed to it. We had used every piece of data the conclave had ever made public, and several pieces it had not realized it had made public. We had cross-referenced, verified, and stress-tested every conclusion until it was airtight. The Galactic Conclave had spent 60 years looking at humanity and seeing a young species with primitive technology and a great deal of enthusiasm. They had never once thought to look at what humanity had quietly built around them. I slipped the drive back into my case, picked up my notebook, and stood up. In the corridor outside, I could hear the delegates returning to the chamber. I could hear the harmonic hum of dozens of translation matrices calibrating, the soft hydraulic sounds of platforms adjusting to their occupants. I buttoned my jacket, I picked up my case, I walked toward the chamber doors. They had laughed at a human delegate. In a few minutes, they were going to understand exactly what that human delegate had been doing while everyone was laughing. I had been taking notes. The session resumed at the 14th hour, Galactic Standard Time. Sarathvel called the chamber to order, and for the first time all day, every delegate fell quiet immediately. They could sense it. I had noticed this about the older species in the conclave. 12,000 years of collective political instinct meant they could feel a change in atmosphere before anyone had said a word. Several delegates were already watching me as I walked back to my platform, not with the casual, dismissive attention of earlier, but with something more careful. Sarathvel announced the matter of the human petition. It said the chamber would hear a summary from the human observer, after which a vote would be held on whether to permanently table the application or refer it to a subcommittee for further review. A subcommittee referral was, as every delegate in the room knew, the political equivalent of a slow and quiet rejection. It could sit in subcommittee for 40 years without ever producing a recommendation. Sarathvel said I had 2 minutes. I stood up. I reached into my case. I did not take out a speech. I did not take out a summary of the petition. I took out a small cylindrical device, no larger than my thumb, and I held it up. I said, with the chamber's permission, I would like to request one small addition to my presentation. Sarathvel's tendrils moved. The dismissive pattern. It said permission was granted in the tone of someone humoring a child. I pressed the top of the device. The holographic projector built into the chamber's ceiling, a piece of technology so old it had been installed before humans had invented the wheel, activated. And what filled that ancient, cathedral-sized sphere was not a petition summary. It was a map. Not of stars, not of territories, something far more complex than either. It was a map of everything. The map had no title. It did not need one. What filled the chamber was a living web of lines, nodes, and data points that stretched from the floor to the invisible ceiling. Every node was a star system. Every line was a connection, a trade route, a communications relay, a biological dependency, a shared resource chain. The web was dense at the core and thinner at the edges, but it covered everything. It covered every species in the room. It covered me too. There was a small node near the edge, newer than most, its lines shorter but its connections surprisingly numerous. Earth, Sol system, the human collective. I let them look at it for exactly 10 seconds. That was intentional. 10 seconds of silence in a chamber of 400 species is a very long time. Then I began to speak. I said, this is the cascading dependency model. It took humanity 31 years to build. It maps every material, biological, economic, and informational dependency between every known spacefaring species in the galaxy, cross-referenced across 6,000 years of conclave trade records, 700 independent scientific databases, and 14,000 bilateral agreements, all of which are public documents available in the conclave's own archive. I paused. I said, we built it because we wanted to understand the galaxy we were asking to join. No one made a sound. I had expected some immediate reaction. Skepticism, perhaps, maybe a procedural objection. What I had not expected was the quality of the silence. It was not the polite silence of an audience waiting for someone to finish. It was the silence of people who had just noticed something and were not yet sure what they were looking at. I moved to the first data point. The Vrethkai Food Synthesis Network. The Vrethkai were one of the conclave's oldest members, and their food production system was considered a marvel of biological engineering. They had spent 4,000 years building a synthesis chain that could feed their entire population from raw stellar materials. It was entirely self-sufficient. Everyone in the galaxy knew this. Everyone in the galaxy was wrong. I highlighted a single node in the Vrethkai network, a molecule a complex organic compound that their synthesis system used as a catalytic agent in the final stage of their food production. Without it, their entire synthesis chain would halt within 8 months. I said, this compound occurs naturally in only 3 places in the known galaxy. 2 of those deposits were exhausted 1100 years ago. The third is in the asteroid belt of the Kepler 442 system. I let that land for a moment. Then I said, the Kepler 442 system was designated as a development zone by Earth's Planetary Development Authority in 2163. Under Conclave Charter, Article 47, Paragraph 9, any uninhabited system within 200 light-years of a member species' home world may be designated for development by that species without requiring conclave approval, provided no other species has filed a prior claim. No claim was ever filed for Kepler 442. We filed our designation form, received automated confirmation, and began operations the following year. The Vrethkai chair, Sarethvel, was very still. I had studied enough recordings of Vrethkai body language to know what stillness meant for them. It did not mean calm. I continued. I moved to the next node, the Pelori Communications Network. The Pelori senator, Urandas, the one who had called us mayflies, sat forward slightly on his platform. I noticed it without looking directly at him. The Pelori maintained the backbone of the Galactic communications grid. They had built it 8,000 years ago and had operated it ever since. 40% of all interstellar communications in the known galaxy pass through Pelori-managed relay stations. It was one of the main reasons the Pelori held such influence in the conclave. Control information, and you hold a great deal of power over those who need it. I highlighted a cluster of relay stations in the central arm of the galaxy. 12 stations, arranged in a specific pattern that allowed them to handle the highest volume of traffic in the network. I said, these 12 stations require a continuous synchronization signal to maintain coherence across the network. Without it, signal degradation begins within 72 hours and becomes catastrophic within 3 weeks. The synchronization signal has to originate from a fixed point with specific gravitational characteristics. There are 9 points in the galaxy that meet the criteria. 8 of them are currently in use by other systems. I pulled up the 9th. I said, the 9th point is located in a region of space that has no official territorial designation, which is unusual because it is extraordinarily useful. 18 years ago, Earth's Deep Space Infrastructure Division filed for operational rights to install a navigation beacon at that location. The application was reviewed by the Conclave's Infrastructure Subcommittee, approved in 11 days because nobody considered it significant, and the beacon has been operational ever since. A pause. I said, the beacon is also the origin point for the Pelori synchronization signal. We did not plan that. We discovered it 5 years after installation, when our engineers were doing routine analysis of signal traffic passing through the region. At that point, we had a choice. We could report the discovery to the conclave and allow it to be reassigned, or we could say nothing and continue to understand what we were looking at. Urandas's harmonic was completely silent. The Pelori delegate, who had not stopped making quiet sounds of one kind or another for 6 hours, was now completely, entirely quiet. I said we chose to continue studying, because it led us to the 3rd dependency and the 4th, and eventually to everything you are looking at now. I stepped back and let the full map glow in the chamber air. I had spent 11 years working on this model, not alone. I want to be clear about that because it matters. My name was on the diplomatic credentials, but 340 people had built what was floating in that chamber. Scientists and economists, historians and engineers, people who had spent years of their lives on a project so classified that most of them could not tell their families what they were working on. I thought about them now. I thought about a woman named Lucy Harding, the xenobiologist who had first identified the Vrethkai compound dependency after 18 months of work on a dataset most of her colleagues had dismissed as unimportant. I thought about a man named Peter Caro, who had spent 4 years tracing the pylori signal network and had nearly quit twice because the data kept contradicting itself until he realized the contradiction was the answer. I thought about a young engineer named Oliver Marsh, who had been fresh out of university when he joined the project and had not taken a full weekend off in 6 years because he believed, with the uncomplicated certainty of someone who has not yet been disappointed enough to stop believing things, that this work mattered. I thought about Clara Bowden's message, "Do not apologize for existing." I continued the presentation. There were 11 primary dependencies in the model. I walked through 7 of them in detail. Each one told the same story in a different way. The galactic economy, the galactic infrastructure, the biological and informational networks that held every species in this room connected to every other, were not as self-sufficient as anyone had assumed. They had evolved over 12,000 years without anyone mapping the whole thing at once. Nobody had ever looked at all of it from the outside. Nobody until us. And almost every dependency in the model ran through, relied upon, adjacent to, or was managed from a point that humanity had quietly, legally, and entirely without drama come to occupy. Not because we had planned it. That was the part I knew they would struggle to believe, but it was true. We had not sat down 40 years ago and drawn a map of vulnerabilities to exploit. We had sat down 40 years ago and tried to understand the galaxy, and the understanding had led us here. I told them that. I said, I want to be direct about something. This model was not built as a threat. No part of it was designed to demonstrate leverage. It was built because humanity has been trying to join this community for 60 years, and we thought that the most useful thing we could do as newcomers asking for a seat was to bring something valuable to the table. We thought a complete map of galactic interdependencies, something that has never existed before, might be considered valuable. I looked at Sorethvel. I said, we thought the conclave might want to know what holds it together. The ancient Vrethkai elder had not moved in 4 minutes. Its tendrils were completely still. That was not a dismissive pattern. I had never seen a recording of a Vrethkai that still. I said, the full dataset is available to every member of the conclave. Every methodology is documented. Every source is cited. We have uploaded the complete archive to the conclave's own servers, and we did so 3 hours ago before this session resumed. Any member species can begin verification immediately. I looked at my notes. There was one more thing I needed to say before they responded. I said, humanity has been waiting 60 years for a seat in this chamber. We are not waiting because we have nothing to offer. We have been waiting because the door was not opened. We are not here today to force anything open. We are here because this is where we have always belonged, and we thought it was finally time to show you why. I sat down. My feet still did not reach the floor. I placed my hands flat on the table, the same way I had when the session began, and I waited for the chamber to respond. For a moment, nothing happened. Then everything happened at once. The first sound was from the Shan. They communicated through bioluminescence, so it was not technically a sound at all. It was a wave of light, a deep blue that pulsed outward from their platform and rippled through their translucent membranes. I had studied the Shan's light language intensively in the 3 years before this trip. Deep blue meant significant new information. Rapid pulse meant urgency. The combination of deep blue and rapid pulse meant we need to reconsider everything we assumed about this situation. Then the Vrethkai began clicking, not the casual, dismissive clicking of earlier. This was a different pattern, harder and more rhythmic, the clicking of a species working through something difficult in real time. Then the pylori began to speak amongst themselves. Urandas turned to his senior, a much older pylori named Orithvi, and spoke in rapid pylori dialect. The translation matrix was not designed to handle simultaneous private conversations, so I only caught fragments. The words it rendered were, "Verify immediately," and "the signal point." The chamber went from silence to noise in under a minute. Not chaos. These were experienced political bodies, but it was the loudest the room had been all day. Sarathvel held up its primary manipulators and called for order. The chamber did not settle immediately, which was itself remarkable. In 12,000 years of proceedings, the Vrethkai presiding chair had always been obeyed instantly. It took 3 calls before the chamber quieted. When it did, Sarathvel spoke in a careful, measured tone that I recognized from the recordings. It was the tone it used when it was performing calm rather than feeling it. It said, "The chamber thanks the human observer for the presentation." It asked whether the data on the conclave's servers was the complete model or an abbreviated version. I said, "It is the complete model. Every variable, every source, every calculation. Nothing has been withheld." Sarathvel said, "And the human collective makes no territorial claims on the basis of this model." I said, "We make no claims of any kind. We are a species applying for membership. We are presenting information that we believe is relevant to the conclave and its member species. What the conclave does with the information is entirely its decision." Sarathvel's tendrils moved briefly. I watched the pattern carefully. It was not dismissive this time. It was uncertain. Yarandas spoke. He did not wait for recognition from the chair. That was unusual enough that several delegates turned to look at him. He said, "The Pelori delegation formally requests that the vote on the human petition be suspended pending independent verification of the presented data." That was the moment I understood that things had already changed. Yarandas had called us mayflies. He had questioned our right to be in the room. He would not be asking for a delay if he thought the data was false. He would be asking for an immediate dismissal. Asking for verification meant he suspected the data was real, and he needed to be certain before he knew how to respond to it. A second voice joined, the Shan representative speaking through a translation device. The Shan said they seconded the request for suspension. Then a third. The Ulani delegate, a wisp of translucent material drifting near its platform, formed a brief dense shape. The translation matrix rendered it as, "Agreed, caution is appropriate." Sarathvel acknowledged the requests. It said the vote on the human petition would be suspended for a period not to exceed 48 hours to allow member species to review the submitted data. It said that during this period, the human observer would remain available to answer questions from member delegations. Then it said something I had not planned for. It said, "The human observer is requested to remain on station and make himself available not as an observer but as a presenting party. The chair is extending a provisional classification of delegate for the purposes of the verification period." I looked up at Sarathvel's platform. Delegate, provisional, temporary, almost certainly revocable, but delegate, not observer, not guest, not the courtesy window left open for a bird to watch from. I said, "The human collective accepts that classification." I thanked the chair. Sarathvel's tendrils moved again. The pattern was brief and small. I had never seen it in any recording. It took me a moment to identify it. When I did, I had to make a conscious effort to keep my expression neutral. It was a Vrethkai expression of respect. The session was suspended. I sat alone at my platform as the delegations withdrew to their private chambers, and I allowed myself 10 seconds of something that was not quite relief and not quite triumph, but was located somewhere between them. Then I picked up my notebook, opened it to a clean page, and began to write. I had 48 hours. There was work to do. What I had not anticipated was how quickly the verification would begin. I had expected political maneuvering, delay tactics, attempts to find procedural grounds to dismiss the data before anyone looked at it too closely. Instead, within 2 hours of the session suspending, I received the first formal request. It came from the Shan. Their representative, a being I will describe as a moving sheet of light with a voice like rain on glass, contacted me through the chamber's communication system. It said the Shan verification team had begun reviewing the dependency model. It said they had found an entry that appeared to involve Shan biological data. It asked whether I could clarify the source of that data. I said, the source is the Shan's own published biological research index, which has been publicly available in the Conclave's archive for 600 years. The specific papers are cited in the model's reference section. I gave the citation numbers. There was a pause. The Shan representative said it would review the citations and return with further questions. 40 minutes later, it returned. It said the citations were accurate. It said the Shan verification team wished to understand how human researchers had connected those papers to the dependency identified in the model, because the connection was not obvious from the papers themselves. I explained it. I walked the Shan representative through Lucy Harding's reasoning, the same 18 months of methodical work that had first identified the pattern, compressed into a 30-minute explanation. The Shan was quiet for most of it. At the end, it said, "This is careful work." I said, "Thank you. We had very good people working on it." The Shan representative said, "May we speak with them?" I said, "I will have to check. Some of them are on Earth, which is a significant communication delay, but I will make every effort." It said, "We would appreciate that." Then it added something that the translation matrix rendered with a slight uncertainty marker, meaning it was dealing with an unusual phrasing. What it said was, "We did not know you were paying this much attention." I thought about that for a long moment after the communication ended. I wrote it in my notebook, circled it. The second contact came from a source I had not expected, a small species from the outer arm called the Thari. They were not powerful in the Conclave. They had been members for only 300 years, which made them junior by galactic standards but still older than humanity's spacefaring history. Their representative was a compact, pale-feathered being named Yiv, and Yiv did not ask a technical question. Yiv said, "We have been trying to explain to the Conclave for 200 years that the outer arm trade routes are vulnerable because of a specific logistical gap in the relay coverage. Nobody listened. We saw that your model includes this gap." I said, "We identified it 8 years ago. It is section 44 in the supplementary data." Yiv said, "We submitted a formal report to the Infrastructure Subcommittee 170 years ago." I said, "I know, we found your report. It is cited in section 44. Yiv was very still for a moment. Then it said, "You found our report from 170 years ago." I said, "We found everything in the archive. That was the point. Everything the Conclave has ever published is in there. Your species' work is cited 43 times in our model." The sound Yiv made was not translatable, but the way it held itself afterward, the posture, the stillness followed by a slow, deliberate movement, felt like something I recognized from human body language. It felt like a person who has spent a very long time feeling ignored and has just discovered they were not. I said, "Your researchers did good work. It deserved to be used." Yiv said it would be in contact. It left. I wrote its name in my notebook. I put a small mark next to it that I used to indicate potential ally. By the 18th hour, I had received 11 formal queries, 2 informal messages through the chamber communication system, and 1 extraordinary visit. The visit came from a delegate I had not expected to approach me at all. Her name, as rendered by the translation matrix, was something close to Aloris. She represented the oldest species on the Conclave floor, a civilization so ancient that their homeworld had long since been converted into a computational structure, their bodies abandoned in favor of pure information systems hosted in physical substrates the size of small moons. They were called the Vast, and they had not initiated contact with any species in over 2,000 years. They participated in sessions through a small device that sat on their platform and translated their outputs into conclave standard communication, but they had not spoken in any session I could find in the public record for 600 years. The device on their platform lit up. The translation matrix flagged it immediately, because it had not flagged a signal from the vast platform in a very long time. The voice it produced was even and quiet. It said, "We have reviewed your model." I said, "I appreciate that." It said, "It is largely correct." I said, "Largely." A pause. It said, "There are 3 additional dependencies your model does not include. They involve systems and events that predate the conclave's current archive. We would provide the data if you are willing to receive it." I put my pen down very carefully. I said, "We are willing." It said, "The model represents something this body has needed for a very long time. We chose not to build it ourselves. We were curious whether anyone would." I said, "Why did you not build it yourselves?" It said, "Because a species that knows where all the threads run might be tempted to pull them. We wanted to see what a species would do with that knowledge before it had any formal power to use it." I said, "And?" It said, "And you uploaded it to the public server before the session resumed." I said nothing. I had not thought of it in those terms exactly. It had been a practical decision, a way of demonstrating that we were not hiding anything, but I heard what the vast was telling me. It said, "We will support the application." Then the light went out, and the device on the vast platform went dark, and nothing further was transmitted from it for the remainder of the verification period. I sat in the quiet chamber for a long time after that. The holographic map was still glowing softly above me, filling the sphere with its web of connections. I looked at the small node near the edge. Earth. Sol system. All those lines running outward. All those connections built quietly, legally, without anyone paying much attention. We had been called mayflies. We had been called insignificant, underdeveloped, too young to understand how the galaxy worked. What they had missed was that youth, if it is the right kind, pays attention to everything. We had paid attention. Now it was time to show them what we had learned. The 48-hour verification period was supposed to be quiet. It was not quiet. Within 12 hours of the model going public on the conclave servers, I had received formal communication from 31 member species. Within 24 hours, the number had risen to 87. By the time the verification period reached its halfway point, the chamber's communication system had logged more traffic than it typically handled in a standard 3-month session. I did not sleep more than 4 hours in those 48. I drank a great deal of water, ate the food packets I had brought from the transport, because the observer lounge had nothing designed for human digestion, and I sat at the small table in that undersized room, and I answered questions. Some questions were technical. Species wanted to understand the methodology, the data sources, the specific calculations behind individual dependencies. I answered those with the help of a secure link to the research team back on Earth. The communication delay meant real-time conversation was impossible, but we had prepared documentation for almost every conceivable technical challenge, and Lucy Harding and Peter Caro were available on rotating shifts to help me fill any gaps. Some questions were political. Species wanted to understand what humanity intended to do with this information. Was it a negotiating tool? Was it the first step in some longer strategy? Would we use it to seek special trade terms? I gave the same answer every time. The model was a gift to the conclave. We were not attaching conditions to it. We had made it available because it was useful, and because the conclave deserved to understand how its own systems worked. What the conclave did with it was entirely within the conclave's discretion. Some questions were more personal. A delegate from a species called the REM, a small, curious species with large, translucent eyes, and a habit of tilting their heads at angles that my human perception found slightly unsettling, came to the observer lounge in the 22nd hour and sat across from me and said, "Why did you wait?" I said, "I do not understand the question." It said, "You built this model. It took 31 years. At some point during those 31 years, you must have understood what it contained. Why did you wait until a formal session to present it? Why not present it earlier? Why not use it earlier?" I said, "Because it was not finished earlier." It tilted its head. It said, "But when it was finished, you waited still. You waited until today." I said, "Yes." It said, "Why?" I thought about that for a moment. It was a good question. The honest answer was complicated, but I had decided before I boarded the transport that if I was going to ask this conclave to trust humanity, then I was going to be honest when honest was hard. I said, "We waited because we were afraid." It tilted its head the other direction. I said, "Not afraid of the conclave, afraid of ourselves. The model shows a great deal of leverage, real leverage, over real systems that real species depend on. There were people on Earth who wanted to use that leverage immediately. There were arguments made, serious arguments by serious people, that we had been waiting 60 years and patience had not gotten us anywhere, and that it was time to be direct about what we had." I stopped. I said, "And then there were other people who said that if we walked in here and held this information over the conclave's head, we would get whatever we asked for in the short term, and we would spend the next 1,000 years trying to live down what we had done to get it. And those people argued that we had not spent 60 years trying to join a community of civilizations, only to introduce ourselves as the species that showed up with a list of things everyone owed us." The REM was very still. I said, "So we waited until we could present it the right way, not as a threat, as information. The difference matters." The REM said, "That is a difficult kind of discipline for a young species." I said, "It was a difficult kind of discipline for these specific humans, too. We argued about it for 6 years. I was part of those arguments. I did not always believe we were making the right choice." It said, "What made you certain in the end?" I said, "Clara Bowden, my predecessor. She told me not to apologize for existing. I thought about that a lot. She did not say do not be afraid or do not make mistakes or make them respect you. She said do not apologize for existing. And I decided that the best version of not apologizing for existing was walking in here and showing them exactly who we are, not what we can threaten, but what we have been doing with our time." The REM looked at me for a long moment. Then it said, "My species has been in this conclave for 900 years. We have spent most of that time feeling like the smallest voice in the room. I would like you to know that what you presented today was the first time in 900 years that I have felt that someone was also paying attention to us." It left. I sat with that for a while. In the 31st hour, the first crisis hit. A faction within the Pelori delegation filed a formal procedural challenge. They claimed that the cascading dependency model constituted an unauthorized intelligence-gathering operation conducted against member species of the conclave. They argued that by collecting and analyzing information about member species' biological and infrastructural vulnerabilities, humanity had violated the conclave's privacy statutes. They called for the model to be removed from the conclave servers and for my delegate status, provisional as it was, to be revoked. I heard about it from a communication sent to me by the Thari delegate Yiv, who had apparently developed a habit of keeping me informed. The message said simply, "Pelori challenge filed. Recommend you prepare response. Good luck." I did not panic. I had been expecting something like this. Not specifically from the Pelori, and not this form exactly, but some kind of procedural countermove from a species that felt exposed by the model's findings. The Pelori had the most to lose from the model becoming official conclave knowledge. Their communications dominance had always been the foundation of their political influence. The model made that dominance visible in a way that other species could now examine, question, and potentially work around. Visibility is a kind of loss for those who benefit from invisibility. I contacted Earth. The communication delay was 11 hours each way, which meant I could not get advice from the research team in time. I was on my own. I went back through the model's documentation and cross-referenced it against the Conclave's privacy statutes. Every source we had used was public. Every data point came from material the Conclave itself had made available, or from species-owned published research, or from observational records that any member species could have accessed. We had not intercepted anything. We had not accessed anything restricted. We had simply read what was available and thought carefully about what it meant. Peter Caro had been extraordinarily careful about this. He had built a full source audit into the model because he had known from the beginning that someone would eventually ask. Every data point in the model had a traceable origin, documented and time-stamped. I prepared my response. When the session resumed in the 36th hour, specifically to address the Pelori challenge, I was ready. The chamber was tense in a way it had not been before. The Pelori faction's filing had introduced something new into the atmosphere, not just political tension, but something closer to alarm. If the challenge succeeded, the model would be pulled and the question of humanity's membership would return to exactly where it had been before my presentation. If it failed, the Pelori would have escalated publicly and gained nothing, which in galactic politics was considered a serious error. Sarathvel opened the floor to the challenge. The lead Pelori lawyer, a precise and careful individual named Orathiel, presented the argument. It was well structured and clearly prepared in advance of my presentation, which told me the Pelori had suspected something like the model might be coming. They had not known specifically what, but they had been watching humanity's preparation activity and had decided to build a legal counter in advance. Smart, insufficient, but smart. Orathiel argued that the systematic collection and analysis of member species vulnerability data, regardless of the public nature of the underlying sources, constituted a form of strategic intelligence gathering that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Conclave's foundational privacy agreements. It was a reasonable argument. In a different situation, about a different piece of work, it might even have succeeded. But they had made one error. I asked for the floor. Sarathvel, whose tone toward me had shifted noticeably since the presentation, granted it without hesitation. I said, the Conclave's privacy statutes, Article 91 through 98, govern the collection of non-public information about member species without consent. I agree with the Pelori interpretation of those articles in principle. They exist for good reasons, and humanity supports them. I let Orathiel look satisfied for exactly 2 seconds. Then I said, however, Article 91, Paragraph 4, specifically exempts information-gathering activities conducted for the purpose of developing scientific or diplomatic instruments to be shared with the Conclave as a whole. The exemption was written in the 3rd century of the Conclave's operation to protect research species who were building what would eventually become the Conclave's own scientific archive. The precedent is established. The exemption has been used 412 times in the Conclave's history. I called up the precedent list on the chamber display. I said, the cascading dependency model was built explicitly as a diplomatic instrument to be shared with the Conclave as a whole. I uploaded it to the Conclave's servers before the session in which it was presented. It has been available to every member species simultaneously, without restriction, since that upload. There is no concealment. There is no selective disclosure. It was shared with everyone the moment it was presented. I looked at Orathiel. I said, humanity is not guilty of gathering intelligence against member species. Humanity conducted research and then gave that research to everyone, openly, immediately. That is not what intelligence gathering looks like. That is what scientific cooperation looks like. The chamber was quiet. Orathiel conferred with the Pelori delegation. The conference lasted 4 minutes. Then Orathiel said the Pelori delegation would not be withdrawing its challenge, but would be submitting it to the legal review body for a full ruling. That was an important distinction. Submitting to the legal review body instead of pressing for an immediate chamber vote meant the Pelori no longer expected to win outright. They were shifting to a delay strategy. They wanted the model's status to remain uncertain while the review process played out, which could take months. I had anticipated this possibility, too. I said, with the chair's permission, I would like to note for the record that submitting this matter to the legal review body is entirely the Pelori delegation's right. I would also like to note that during any review period, the model remains uploaded and publicly accessible on the conclave servers. Any attempt to restrict access to it during the review would itself require a conclave vote, as the data was uploaded as a public submission. And any attempt to hold the vote on Earth's membership application pending the review's outcome would require the chamber to confirm that the review has direct bearing on the application's validity, which has not been established. I paused. I said, Earth is willing to wait for a clean process. We have been waiting 60 years. We are practiced at it. But I want the chamber to be clear that procedural delay is not the same as uncertainty about our qualifications. Sarethvel looked at me for a long moment. Then it said something I did not expect. It said, the chair notes that the human delegate has demonstrated a familiarity with conclave procedural law that exceeds what is typical for applicant species. I said, we have had 60 years to read the documentation. There was a sound in the chamber that the translation matrix could not categorize. It came from multiple species at once. After a moment, I realized what it was. It was laughter, different from Yarindas's performance in the morning session. This was not laughter at me. It was laughter with a different shape entirely, the shape of an audience that has realized the person they underestimated has been paying attention the whole time. The legal review body submission was accepted. The Pelori challenge would proceed through that channel, but the chamber vote on Earth's membership application was not suspended. Sarethvel ruled that the Pelori challenge had not demonstrated sufficient direct connection to the application's validity to justify postponement. The vote would proceed the following morning. I returned to the observer lounge. I ate the last of my food packets. I opened my notebook to a blank page and I wrote, in careful letters, tomorrow. Then I looked at the photograph of the 60-year-old delegation, all those people smiling in front of their building. I thought about every person who had sat in a chair with their feet, not reaching the floor. I thought about tomorrow. I did not sleep at all. The morning session was called at the 9th hour, Galactic Standard Time. I had been in the chamber since the 7th. Not because I needed the time. The presentation was finished. My arguments were prepared. Every possible countermove I could anticipate had a response waiting. I was there early because I wanted to be in the room when it was empty. I wanted to sit in that enormous sphere before 412 delegations filled it, and I wanted to look at it without anyone watching me look at it. It was extraordinary. Even after 2 days, even after everything, it was extraordinary. The platforms were all empty. The lights were dim, set to a general maintenance level rather than the species-specific tuning that would come on as delegates arrived. The holographic model was still there, softly glowing, the full web of galactic connections floating in the dim air. In this light, with no one around, it looked less like a political argument and more like something natural, like a photograph of a neural network or the root system of an enormous tree. Everything connected to everything else. That was what the model showed, more than any specific dependency. It showed that the galaxy was not a collection of separate civilizations moving in parallel. It was one system, ancient and intricate, in which no species was fully independent of any other, and no action in one part of it failed to send ripples through the rest. Humanity had figured that out. We had built a map of it, And then, instead of using it to pull threads, we had handed the map to everyone. I thought about the oldest intelligence in the room, a civilization so far beyond what we were that I could not fully comprehend their perspective, and what they had said. We were curious whether anyone would. They had watched for however long they had been watching, and the test had not been whether we could find the leverage. The test was what we chose to do with it. I thought about Clara Bowden, who was 83 years old and had spent 9 years of her life getting the conclave to write a single sentence, acknowledging that humanity was not a threat. I thought about Lucy Harding, who had found the Vrethkai compound dependency in an 18-month stretch of work that most of her colleagues had dismissed before she had even finished explaining it. I thought about Peter Caro, who had nearly quit twice. I thought about Oliver Marsh, who had believed with the uncomplicated certainty of a young person that the work mattered. I thought about the 60-year-old photograph. I thought about do not apologize for existing. The lights shifted as the chamber systems began their pre-session calibration. The platforms glowed with the gentle signals that told each delegation their environment was ready. Somewhere beyond the chamber walls, the corridors would be filling. Species that had spent the last 48 hours reviewing data, consulting with their home governments, arguing amongst themselves, were making their way to their seats. I had 1 hour. I took out my notebook. I opened it to a clean page. At the top, I wrote a single question: what do humans want? It was the question Urandas had not asked, but that everyone in the room was going to be thinking. They had spent 2 days with the model. They had verified enough of it to know it was real. They understood now something about the position humanity occupied in the galactic network. Not central, not dominant, but relevant in ways that were real and not going away. They knew what we had. The question that every political instinct in that chamber was going to be asking was, what are they going to do with it? I had not answered that question in the presentation. I had said we were not making demands. I had said the model was a gift. But that was not the same as answering the question, and I knew that in the vote session, someone was going to ask it directly. I wrote the answer in my notebook, not the political answer, the true one. We wanted to belong. That was it. That was the whole answer. 60 years of petitions and 60 years of rejection and 60 years of humans sitting in chairs with their feet not touching the floor. And at the end of it, the answer was the same one it had always been. We were a young species in a very old galaxy. We had looked up at the stars long before we had the means to reach them. And when we had the means, we had come out here. And we had found that the galaxy was full and complicated and ancient and not especially interested in us. And we had decided as a species that we were going to keep trying anyway, because the alternative was to go home and close the door, and that was not something humans were built to do. We wanted to belong, and we had come here with the most honest thing we could offer, the truth of what we had learned. The first delegates began arriving at the 43rd minute of my hour. I watched them come in. Most of them did not look at me directly, but I noticed the difference from the day before. 2 days ago, delegates had glanced at my platform with the casual, uncurious gaze of people looking at something they considered unremarkable. Today, when they looked, they held the gaze a moment longer. Some of them nodded. A few made species-specific gestures I could not fully interpret, but whose general register, acknowledgement, something close to greeting, I could read. The Theri delegate, Yiv, caught my eye across the chamber. Its head moved in a small, precise motion. I had looked up Theri body language after our conversation. The motion meant, I see you. I made the nearest human equivalent. I hoped it translated. Urandas arrived with the full Pelori delegation. He did not look at me. He sat down and immediately engaged in a low conversation with his senior, Orithvi. I watched Orithvi's posture. Orithvi was still, but not with the tight stillness of a species preparing to fight. It was a considered stillness, the stillness of someone who had made a decision. Sarethvel arrived last, as the presiding chair always did. It moved to its platform with the unhurried deliberateness of a being that had occupied this room for most of its 400-year life. When it settled, its tendrils spread in the formal opening pattern. The chamber came to order. Sarethvel said, "The chamber is convened for the final session on the matter of the human collective's application for full membership. The verification period has concluded. The floor is open for member statements before the vote." There was a brief pause, the usual moment when delegates calibrated their translation matrices and settled into session. Then the first speaker signaled. It was not a species I had expected to speak. It was the Ulani, the beings of drifting gas, who almost never took the floor in formal sessions, preferring to register their votes in silence. Their translation device rendered their communication in a voice like distant wind. The Ulani said, "The Ulani Collective has reviewed the dependency model submitted by the human delegate. We confirm the accuracy of the sections pertaining to Ulani systems. We note that the model identified two systemic vulnerabilities in our long-range communication network that we had not ourselves identified. We note further that these vulnerabilities were included in the model without comment, simply as data, without any indication of how they might be exploited. The Ulani Collective considers this to be an accurate reflection of how the model was presented overall. We will be voting in favor of the human application." Sarethvel acknowledged the statement and called for the next speaker. The REM spoke next. They said much of what their delegate had told me in the Observer Lounge, formally and for the record, that the model had treated every species' data with equal care, that smaller species had been represented with the same precision as larger ones, and that the REM had found their own 200-year-old research cited correctly and in context. The REM would be voting in favor. Then the Shan spoke. The deep blue bioluminescence filled their platform. Their translation matrix rendered it as, "The cascading dependency model represents the most significant contribution to galactic systems knowledge in the last 3,000 years. The Shan vote in favor." 3,000 years, I wrote that down. The Thari spoke. Yiv's voice was steady and clear. The Thari said that they had been members of this conclave for 300 years, and that in 300 years they had submitted 240 formal reports to various conclave bodies, and had received substantive responses to 9 of them. They said that a species capable of finding and correctly citing Thari research from 170 years ago, in a model of this scope and precision, was a species that had taken the trouble to listen. The Thari would be voting in favor. Yiv looked at me after it finished speaking. I held its gaze. One after another, species took the floor. Not all of them were in favor. A cluster of mid-tier species from the inner arm who had always aligned with the Pelori on membership questions spoke in careful, neutral terms about the need for further review and the importance of established process. They were not hostile, but they were not ready. I respected that. A single presentation did not undo 60 years of political positioning, and I had not expected it to. A species called the Vane, who occupied a strategically important set of systems near the galactic core, made a longer statement. They said the model was impressive, but that they had concerns about the precedent of granting membership to a species whose first major act had been to demonstrate the depth of its understanding of other species' vulnerabilities. They said they were not accusing humanity of bad intent, but that intent and outcome were different things. I appreciated that statement more than almost any of the favorable ones. It was honest. It was the legitimate concern, stated plainly. It deserved a plain response. Sarethvel looked at me. It said, "The delegate may respond to questions raised on the floor." I stood. I said, "The Vane delegate raises a concern that is worth addressing directly, because it is the real concern, the one underneath all the procedural discussions of the last 48 hours. The concern is not about whether the data is accurate. The concern is about what kind of species we are. I said, I cannot prove intent. No one can. You can only look at what someone has done and draw conclusions from that. So let me tell you what humanity has done. I said, 31 years ago, we started building this model because we wanted to understand the galaxy we were asking to join. We could have stopped when we had enough information for a compelling petition. We did not stop. We kept going until the model was complete, because we thought that if we were going to present it, it should be as honest and comprehensive as we could make it. We made the decision to share everything, not just the parts that made us look good, and not to select which species received the information first, but to put it on a public server where everyone could access it at the same time. I said, those are choices, and they are not the choices of a species that built this model as a weapon. They are the choices of a species that built this model as a handshake. The chamber was very quiet. I said, we do not want leverage over the conclave. We want to sit in it. We want to contribute to it. We are young, and we know we are young, and we have a lot to learn from the species in this room, and we have been saying that for 60 years, and we will keep saying it because it is true. I looked at Sorethvel. I said, but we are also, as someone in this chamber noted 2 days ago, the species that paid enough attention to build this. We are not a small presence. We are not insignificant. We are not mayflies. We are a young species with a great deal of history still ahead of us, and we would very much like to build that history here, as members of this community, rather than outside it looking in. I sat down. The chamber was quiet for 8 seconds. I counted them. Then Sorethvel said, the chair will acknowledge one further statement before the vote. The device on the vast platform lit up. The chamber went absolutely still. I had been told that when the vast spoke, the conclave listened, not out of political obligation but out of something older and more instinctive, the same way that every species in the room would have listened before spaceflight if an elder of unimaginable age had decided to speak. The voice was even and quiet, the same as before. It said, this conclave was built on the idea that civilized species are stronger together than apart. That idea has been tested many times in 12,000 years. It has survived because, at the moments that mattered, the species in this room chose community over advantage. The human delegate has presented us with one of those moments. The choice is not whether to accept a species that has demonstrated leverage. The choice is whether to accept a species that had leverage and offered cooperation instead. A pause. It said, we do not often find that combination. The device went dark. Sorethvel called the vote. I will not describe every moment of it because some things do not need to be extended. The vote was not close. It was not the narrow, procedural outcome that 60 years of diplomatic history might have suggested. It was decisive. 289 in favor, 63 against, 60 abstentions. The required threshold for full membership was 250. Earth had been granted full membership in the Galactic Conclave. I sat very still for a moment. I put my pen down on the table. I looked at the holographic map still glowing above the chamber, the web of connections, the small node near the edge with all its lines running outward. I thought Lucy, I thought Peter, I thought Oliver, I thought Clara. I thought about everyone I could not name because there were too many of them. Every person who had worked on the model, every person who had made a petition before me and been turned away, every person who had looked up at the sky and wondered when. Sorethvel was speaking. It was saying formal things about the administrative process, about the integration of Earth into conclave systems, about the assignment of permanent delegate credentials. I was listening, but I was also, at the same time, somewhere else entirely. I was thinking about a specific Tuesday morning, 5 years ago, when I had been sitting in a small office at the Department of Interstellar Affairs, reading a rejection notice from the Conclave's membership committee, and I had thought, very briefly, that we were never going to get here. I had said as much to Oliver Marsh, who had been 26 years old and had been working on the model for 2 years at that point. He had looked at me with an expression of complete bafflement and said, "Of course, we are going to get there. We just have to finish the work." I had not thought about that moment in 2 years. It came back to me now, very clearly, the small office and the rejection notice and Oliver's bafflement. We had finished the work. When the formal proceedings concluded, I stepped off my platform for the first time in 3 days. The chamber was filling with the low noise of delegations preparing to depart, the sounds of platforms disengaging, translation matrices powering down. Several delegates approached me. The REM delegate made a gesture I had looked up, a REM hand movement that meant something like, "Well done," and also, "Thank you." The Thari delegate, Yiv, walked over and stood beside me and said nothing, which I had also learned was a Thari expression of solidarity. We stood together for a moment in silence, and it was the most comfortable silence I had experienced since I left Earth. Urandas approached last. I had wondered about this. I had not expected a Pelori apology because the Pelori language had no word for it, as I said, but I had not been sure what to expect instead. Urandas stopped in front of me and was quiet for a moment. Then it said something in Pelori that the translation matrix rendered as, "The observation about mayflies was poorly considered." I said, "The observation about forests was not wrong, though. You should not take advice about managing something from those who have just arrived in it." Urandas regarded me. I said, "But you should perhaps check whether the newly arrived have been paying attention on the way in." There was a long pause. Then Urandas made the Pelori harmonic that the translation matrix rendered as, "accepted." It was, in Pelori terms, both a concession and a beginning. I noted it carefully. The construction crew arrived for the chamber modifications before I reached the corridor. I heard it before I saw it, the sound of materials being moved, structures being assembled, the particular busy noise of people working quickly toward a deadline. I turned back and looked through the chamber doors. They were building a new platform. Not adapting an existing one, building a new one from the floor positioned at the level of the mid-tier delegates, not the lowest level where the observer platform sat, the middle level, among the established members. The platform was being built at a human scale. The chair being assembled beside it was designed for human proportions, not too tall, feet on the floor. I watched them work. It took 41 minutes. I stood in the corridor doorway the entire time, because this was one of the moments that was going to matter in 50 years when I tried to remember it clearly, and I did not want to look away. When it was done, it was a simple platform. Clean lines, pale material, functional, nothing decorative, just a place at the table. One of the construction workers looked up and saw me watching. It was a young Vrethkai. Its tendrils moved in a short, uncertain pattern. I did not recognize the pattern, which meant it was probably informal, not something that appeared in the diplomatic recordings. I made a human gesture in return, a small nod, and after a moment the young Vrethkai made what I interpreted as the Vrethkai equivalent of a nod back. Then it returned to work. I sent my transmission to Earth from the corridor. The message was 11 hours away and the response would take 11 more, so I would not hear anything until I was back on the transport. But I needed to send it now. The message said, "We're in." 2 words. Clara Bowden had told me not to apologize for existing, and she had spent 9 years of her life getting 1 sentence into the formal record, and she was 83 years old and she deserved to know. I did not write a long message. 2 words felt right. They were enough. They were everything. I walked back through the corridor and out into the docking bay. My transport was a small vessel, compact and functional, nothing impressive. It was the same vessel that had brought me here, that had carried me 40 light years from the world I had grown up on. Standing beside it, looking at it, I felt a strange tenderness for the unremarkable little ship. I boarded. I stowed my case. I sat down in the single-passenger seat and looked out the viewport at the Conclave Station, the sphere that orbited a dying star, the place where 12,000 years of galactic history had been made and continued to be made. Somewhere in there, a new platform was waiting. I thought about Lucy Harding coming home from 18 months of work on a dataset everyone had dismissed, and the look on her face when it turned out she was right. I thought about Peter Caro at his desk in the 4th year, the year he almost quit, staring at contradictory data that turned out to be the answer. I thought about Oliver Marsh saying, "Of course we are going to get there," and meaning it completely. I thought about the 60-year-old photograph, all those people smiling, all that optimism directed forward into a future they would not live to see. I thought about Clara. The transport undocked. The stars slid into view through the viewport, the same stars that had been there my entire life, unchanged by anything that had happened in the last 3 days, and yet somehow different. Not the stars themselves, my relationship to them. I had been my whole career a person standing outside a door. I was going home to a species that was now, officially, finally, standing inside. I opened my notebook to the last page of notes. At the top I had written, "What do humans want?" Below it I had written the true answer, to belong. I crossed both lines out. Not because the answer was wrong, because it was no longer a question. The transport accelerated away from the station. I watched the conclave sphere grow smaller in the viewport until it was just a point of light among thousands of others, and then it was gone. I looked at the stars. For the first time in 11 years, I had nothing left to prepare. I put my notebook away, leaned back in the seat, and for a long moment I allowed myself to feel exactly how much this had cost, every late night and rejected petition and moment of doubt, all the years that had been spent on this singular, impossible, completely necessary thing. Then I closed my eyes. In 11 hours, Clara Bowden was going to read 2 words. That was enough. That was everything.